He was written as a deep-dyed, snarling villain, and he bored the out of me, because there is no longevity in deep-dyed, snarling villainy. And already I started to plan what I was going to do about that. Irwin not only allowed me to do that, but one day said, do more. And I did. And the rest, as we say, is history.
When June Lockhart passed away on October 23rd, 2025, at the age of 100, she took with her the last direct adult linked to a spaceship that never actually reached its destination. The Robinson family of Lost in Space spent 3 seasons flying toward Alpha Centauri and never got there. But off camera, the real story of that show was even stranger than anything that happened on the Jupiter 2, a tug-of-war between actors, a producer who rewrote his own show on the fly, and a cast that quietly held on to each other for 60 years after the camera stopped rolling. Here is what most fans never fully pieced together. By the time Lockhart died, only 3 of the original Robinson children remained. Bill Mumy, who played 10-year-old genius Will Robinson and was in his early 70s. Angela Cartwright, who played his sister Penny and was close behind him in age. And Marta Kristen, who played eldest daughter Judy and had crossed 80. All 3 had spent decades doing something unusual for former child stars. They kept showing up in each other's lives. Fan conventions, joint interviews, photographs taken together well into their 70s and 80s. It wasn't nostalgia for a paycheck. People who worked alongside them for years have described it as a friendship that simply never had a reason to end. That loyalty stands out more sharply against how the show itself actually ended. Lost in Space ran for 83 episodes across 3 seasons on CBS, and it never got a real finale. The final episode filmed left the Robinsons still stranded on an alien world, with cast and crew genuinely believing a 4th season had already been arranged. It hadn't been. CBS canceled the series in February 1968, and by most accounts of news reached the cast the way bad news often reached actors in that era, secondhand, through agents, trade papers, or the morning newspaper, rather than a phone call from the studio thanking them for 3 years of work. There was no wrap party. No goodbye, just a show that stopped. If there is one twist in the story that even casual fans sense but rarely understand fully, it's what happened to the role of Dr. Zachary Smith. As written in the original pilot script, Smith was not a source of comic relief. He was Saboteur, a cold operative planted aboard the Jupiter 2 to sabotage the mission, a character built to be eliminated a few episodes into the run. Jonathan Harris, the actor cast in the role, had spent his life reinventing himself. He had changed his own surname as a teenager and built an acting career almost entirely through a rather than pedigree. He looked at the character on the page and recognized a dead end rather than an opportunity. So he started changing it. Harris began showing up with revised dialogue, softening Smith's menace and layering in vanity, cowardice, and a running comic feud with the robot that was never in the original scripts. Producer Irwin Allen initially had no idea how much of his show was being quietly rewritten from the inside. By the time it became obvious, the fan mail made the decision for him. Smith had become the character audiences most wanted to see. Harris eventually negotiated a special guest star credit that ran on nearly every episode of the series, an unusual arrangement for what had started as a minor villain role. The trouble was that every minute Dr. Smith gained on screen came from somewhere. And the man it came from was supposed to be the actual star of the show. Guy Williams arrived on Lost in Space as one of the more bankable names on American television, having spent 4 years as the title character in Disney's Zorro. He was cast as John Robinson, the family's commander, and the character the series was originally built around. What happened instead, gradually, was that his screen time shrank season by season as the Smith and Robot storylines expanded to fill the space he had once occupied. Cast members who lived through it, including co-star Mark Goddard, later described real tension on set as Williams watched the show drift away from the role he'd signed on to play. After the cancellation, Williams found that American television had little further use for him, but that somewhere else in the world, the opposite was true. Zorro had become a genuine cultural touchstone in Argentina, and Williams spent much of his remaining life living there, embraced in a way Hollywood never quite managed. He died in Buenos Aires in 1989, at 65, following a brain aneurysm, reportedly not discovered by others for some time, in an era before mobile phones made isolation harder to miss. It is a quietly haunting detail. a man cast to lead a landmark American science fiction series, ended his life better known and more celebrated on another continent entirely. No character on Lost in Space is more visually iconic than a robot, and almost no one at the time knew the name of the man who made it move. Bob May spent 3 seasons operating the suit from the inside, a heavy, largely airtight costume that became brutally hot under studio lighting. Multiple accounts from people who worked on the show describe genuinely dangerous conditions inside that costume, including instances where May reportedly lost consciousness briefly during filming because of heat and poor ventilation. Because so much of the era's television production simply moved forward on tight schedules, safety concerns that would stop a set today were treated as inconvenient interruptions then. May was never credited on screen for the role during the show's original run, which meant lower pay and diminished residuals, even as Lost in Space grew into a franchise with decades of syndication and merchandising income behind it. What stands out about May's later life isn't bitterness. By most accounts from people who met him at fan conventions, he became known as one of the warmest, most patient guests on the circuit, someone who stayed at autograph tables well past his allotted time because he didn't want any fan to leave disappointed. He died in 2009. The character he brought to life for 3 years never once, on screen, revealed what the job actually cost him. Long before there was a wisecracking stowaway or a robot with an accordion voice box, Irwin Allen produced a very different pilot, titled No Place to Hide. It was filmed in 1964 on what was, at the time, one of the largest budgets ever assigned to a television pilot. It played almost entirely straight. A family of scientists, the Robinsons, is thrown off course en route to Alpha Centauri and forced to survive on an unknown planet using intelligence and teamwork. There was no Dr. Smith. There was no robot. There was no villain at all. Just a family facing a genuinely hostile unknown. CBS executives liked it enough to buy the series on the spot, but they didn't want the pilot as filmed. Network notes pushed for a recurring antagonist to generate ongoing conflict without needing a new external threat every week, and for a robot character that could anchor merchandising. The result was a redesigned ship, a new character in Dr. Smith, and a mechanical crew member that hadn't existed in the original concept. Much of the original pilot's footage was later folded into the first handful of Season 1 episodes, with new dialogue explaining why Smith and the robot happened to be absent from scenes that had actually been filmed before either character existed. It's a strange piece of television trivia. Several of the show's earliest episodes are quietly built around footage from a version of Lost in Space that audiences never actually got to see as it was originally intended. The show that resulted premiered in September 1965, at a moment when the era's most expensive standing television interior set, the Jupiter 2 itself, sat on a soundstage that cost more to build than any comparable set on television at the time. Its theme music was composed by a young, largely unknown composer named Johnny Williams, who would later become known simply as John Williams and go on to score some of the most recognizable film music in history. Ask most people today which 1960 science fiction show won the ratings battle of its era, and they'll usually guess Star Trek. The reality is closer to the opposite. Through their overlapping runs, Lost in Space consistently drew a significantly larger weekly audience than Star Trek managed at any point in its original 3 seasons. The two shows are remembered very differently today, largely because of what happened after cancellation. Syndication, fan culture, and decades of critical reappraisal treated them on almost opposite trajectories. Behind the scenes, though, the supposed rivalry was often overstated. Crew members across both productions, particularly in makeup and effects, frequently knew each other and shared resources when budgets or schedules got tight, a detail that occasionally led fans to accuse one show of copying the other, when the truth was closer to 2 overworked crews helping each other survive brutal production timelines. The most unexpected crossover, though, belonged to Bill Mumy. While playing Will Robinson by day, he was, by his own later admission, a genuine fan of Star Trek in his off hours, enthusiastic enough about the supposedly rival franchise that decades later he took a guest role in an episode of Star Trek, Deep Space Nine, playing a Starfleet officer who dies in the course of the story. It's the kind of detail that undercuts the idea of a bitter feud between the two shows and suggests something closer to mutual respect between people working in the same small corner of the industry. If there's one episode that captures everything strange about how Lost in Space ended its run, It's The Great Vegetable Rebellion, in which Dr. Smith is put on trial by a sentient plant creature and threatened with being turned into a stalk of celery, opposite a villain played by an actor in a full-body carrot costume. It has become shorthand, fairly or not, for the show's descent into pure camp during its final season, and it's often cited as evidence that Lost in Space had drifted a long way from the serious survival story Irwin Allen originally set out to make. And yet the episode has had a stranger afterlife than its reputation suggests. When TV Guide published a retrospective ranking of the greatest television episodes of all time in the 1990s, The Great Vegetable Rebellion made the list, ranked by that particular publication's judgment, ahead of the